The massive transport ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel with a gentle shudder that made Tom grip his seat tighter. Through the observation window, he could see the famous Ring of Knowledge, the biggest space station in the known galaxy and home to the Galactic University of Applied Sciences. The structure was so large it looked like someone had built a metal ring around a small moon. Tom checked his acceptance letter for the 100th time. The golden seal of the university still gleamed, making it real. He was the first human to be accepted since Earth joined the galactic community 3 years ago. His hands went to his backpack, feeling the familiar shape of his grandfather's dowsing rods wrapped in an old cloth. They weren't on the approved equipment list, but he couldn't leave them behind. They were his good luck charm. The ship's arrival area was packed with beings from across the galaxy. Tall, willowy aliens with skin like glass walked gracefully past floating gas-filled creatures that changed colors as they moved. Tom noticed how others kept their distance from him. He was used to it by now. Being from Earth, classified as a Deathworld, made other species nervous. A small blue alien wearing what looked like a silver suit stepped forward, holding up a sign with Earth's symbol. "Student Tom," it asked, voice coming through a translator device. "I am Guy Blue, your orientation assistant. Please follow me and try not to move too quickly. Your high-gravity planet adaptations make many species uncomfortable." Tom nodded and deliberately slowed his pace. He'd learned about this in his pre-departure briefing. What felt like a casual walk to him looked like aggressive rushing to others. He followed Guide Blue through crowded corridors, noticing how conversations stopped when he passed. Some smaller aliens even pressed themselves against the walls. "Your living quarters are in the heavy gravity section," Guide Blue explained, leading him to a different part of the station. "We've reinforced the floor and furniture to handle your planet's native strength. You'll share this area with students from other high-gravity worlds, though none quite as extreme as Earth." The door slid open to reveal a simple room with sturdy-looking furniture. Through the window, Tom could see the curve of the station stretching into the distance. It was beautiful, but it made his heart ache for home, for the mountains where he and his grandfather had spent summers searching for underground springs with nothing but 2 bent metal rods and centuries of passed-down knowledge. "Your class schedule has been uploaded to your room's computer," Guide Blue continued. "Tomorrow you'll begin orientation with Professor Firstlight in Geological Sciences." The professor was hesitant about accepting a Deathworlder into the program. "I suggest you make a good impression." After Guide Blue left, Tom unpacked his few belongings. He carefully placed his grandfather's dowsing rods on the desk, remembering the old man's words. Sometimes the oldest tools work better than the newest machines, if you know how to listen to them. His grandfather would have loved to see this place, to learn how other worlds found their water and minerals. A chime from the room's computer interrupted his thoughts. A message scrolled across the screen. "Notice to all students. Tomorrow's orientation includes practical demonstrations of advanced geological scanning equipment. Bring your assigned devices. Personal equipment from pre-spaceflight civilizations is strictly prohibited." Tom looked at the dowsing rods and then back at the message. With a small smile, he wrapped them up again and tucked them into his bag. Prohibited or not, they were staying with him. He didn't plan to use them. They were just a reminder of home. But as he prepared for bed that night, adapting to the strange sounds of the space station, he couldn't help wondering what his grandfather would say about scanning for water among the stars. The artificial night cycle dimmed the lights in his room, but Tom lay awake for a long time, thinking about tomorrow. He was carrying the hopes of his whole planet with him. Earth was seen as a backwater world, barely civilized, too dangerous to visit. But he was going to prove that humans belonged here among the stars, even if he had to work twice as hard to do it. Tom sat at the back of the classroom, trying to make himself look smaller, the geological scanner in front of him, a sleek device worth more than everything his family owned, displayed readings he could barely understand. Around him, other students worked smoothly with their equipment, their many limbs dancing across control surfaces with practiced ease. Professor Firstlight floated at the front of the room, their crystalline body catching and splitting the light into rainbow patterns. Today's practical exam will test your ability to locate subsurface water deposits. The university has provided access to Training Moon 7 for this purpose. The professor's translated voice carried a note of disdain when their gaze fell on Tom. All students must demonstrate proficiency with standard equipment before advancing. The class moved to the shuttle bay, where small ships waited to take them to the training moon. Tom ended up sharing his shuttle with a tall insectoid student who clicked nervously whenever Tom moved. The flight was short but uncomfortable. Training Moon 7 was a dusty, barren place. The student group spread out across its surface, working with their scanners under the light of an orange sun. Tom followed the procedures he'd memorized, but his scanner kept showing conflicting readings. Sweat formed on his forehead, despite his environment suit's cooling system. Human student, Professor Firstlight's voice crackled through his helmet comm. Your results are inconsistent. You have 10 minutes remaining to locate a viable water deposit, or you will fail this examination. Tom's hands shook as he adjusted the scanner settings again. The readings jumped wildly, making even less sense than before. He could feel the stares of his classmates, some pitying, others smug. The expensive scanner blinked once and went dark. Complete system failure. In that moment of desperation, Tom felt the weight of his grandfather's dowsing rods in his sample collection bag. He had packed them automatically that morning, not even thinking about it. He looked at the dead scanner, then at the professor hovering nearby, then at the rods. What do I have to lose? He muttered to himself. With shaking hands, he pulled out the simple metal rods, earning surprised buzzes and clicks from nearby students. The rods were awkward to hold with his thick gloves, but he'd done this hundreds of times back home. He closed his eyes, trying to focus past his embarrassment. He began to walk slowly across the moon's surface, holding the rods out in front of him. At first, nothing happened. Then, he felt it. The subtle pull he knew so well from Earth. The rods crossed decisively, pointing downward. Human student, what are you doing? Professor Firstlight's voice was sharp with disapproval. This is a scientific examination, not a time for primitive rituals. Please, Tom said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Scan this spot. Deep scan, at least 50 meters down. He planted a marker flag where the rods had crossed. The professor made a sound like tinkling glass, their species' version of a dismissive laugh. But they waved another student forward with a professional-grade scanner. The machine hummed to life, its holographic display expanding outward. The student operating it suddenly made a surprised chirping sound. Professor, there's a massive water deposit, 57 meters down, trapped in a crystalline cavity. It's the largest deposit anyone has found today. Silence fell across the training area. Professor Firstlight's crystalline body flickered with patterns Tom couldn't interpret. Other students crowded around, their own scanners confirming the reading. Impossible. One student buzzed. Those are just bent metal sticks. It must be a coincidence. Do you want me to find another one? Tom offered, his confidence growing. The familiar weight of the dowsing rods in his hands felt right, like meeting an old friend. Professor Firstlight's translation device was silent for a long moment. Finally, they spoke. Human student, demonstrate your technique again. Class, record all readings. If this is truly not a coincidence. They left the sentence unfinished. Tom smiled inside his helmet and began to walk again, the rods held out before him. He could feel it now, the subtle fields and forces that his grandfather had taught him to notice. The same ones that existed on Earth existed here too, just waiting for someone to listen to them. Behind him, 24 different types of scanners recorded his every move, as he prepared to show them all what a human with 2 simple metal rods could do. News spread quickly through the ring of knowledge. Within 2 days, everyone had heard about the human student who found water using metal sticks. Some laughed it off as lucky guessing, while others demanded scientific investigation. The halls buzzed with debate, and Tom noticed even more stares than before. but now they were filled with curiosity instead of just fear. Professor Firstlight called Tom to their office early in the morning. The professor's crystalline form glowed with subtle patterns as Tom entered the room. The office walls were covered in holographic displays showing geological data from 100 different worlds. "Sit down, human student," the professor said through their translator. "Your demonstration on Training Moon 7 has caused quite a stir. The faculty is divided. Some want to dismiss it as primitive superstition. Others, the professor's light patterns shifted to a deep blue. Others want to understand it." Tom sat carefully in the reinforced chair. "I can show you how it works, Professor. My grandfather taught me." "Your grandfather was not a scientist," First Light interrupted. "But you are here to become one. So I propose a proper scientific challenge." The professor activated a large hologram showing 3 different worlds. 3 tests. Your metal rods against our best scanning technology. If you succeed, the university will fund a research program to study your method. If you fail, you will focus solely on approved techniques. Do you accept? Tom looked at the worlds spinning in the hologram. One was a desert planet with deep canyons, another was covered in ice, and the third appeared to be a massive asteroid. Each would present different challenges. He thought about his grandfather's words about trusting what you feel, not just what you see. "I accept," Tom said firmly. "When do we start?" "Now," the professor replied. "The news feeds are already carrying the story. Representatives from 12 different scientific institutions will observe. The university's reputation is at stake. Are you certain your primitive tools are ready for such scrutiny?" Tom stood up, squaring his shoulders. "Those primitive tools helped my family survive for generations. I'm not ashamed of them." The challenge turned into a major event. The main lecture hall was packed with observers from across the galaxy. Floating camera drones transmitted everything to millions of viewers. Tom saw some humans in the audience, Earth's ambassador and a small scientific team. They looked nervous but proud. A panel of judges explained the rules. Each location would test a different aspect of geological surveying. The desert planet would test for deep water deposits. The ice world would require finding liquid water under solid ice. The asteroid would challenge them to locate rare mineral deposits. The university's team went first on the desert planet. They used equipment worth millions of credits, creating perfect 3-dimensional maps of the underground. Their results were exact, scientific, and detailed. The audience hummed with approval. Then it was Tom's turn. He walked out onto the desert surface with just his dowsing rods. The sun beat down through his environment suit as he began to work. He felt the familiar pull of the rods, stronger here than on the training moon. The rods crossed sharply, and he placed a marker. Then another, and another. Each time, follow-up scans confirmed water deposits. "Different," one judge noted. "The human finds water sources our scans missed. Less precise measurements, but better at finding hidden deposits." On the ice world, Tom's rods led him to underground rivers that the scanners had trouble detecting through the complex ice layers. The asteroid proved trickier. The rods worked differently with minerals than with water. But Tom remembered his grandfather's lessons about how the pull felt slightly different for various materials. By the end of the first day, the results were too close to call. The scientific team had better precision and could provide exact measurements. But Tom found things their scanners missed, especially in complex geological formations. The judges called for more tests. As Tom packed up his rods, a young alien student approached him carefully. Could you show me how they work?" the student asked. Soon, others gathered around, their fear of the Deathworlder forgotten in their curiosity about his mysterious tools. Tom smiled, remembering how his grandfather had taught him. "The key isn't in the rods," he said. "It's in learning to feel what they're telling you. Here, let me show you." He held out the rods, ready to pass on what he had learned, just as his grandfather had done for him. After the first day of challenges, Tom couldn't sleep. His mind kept racing, trying to understand why the dowsing rods worked better in some places than others. He sat in the university's library pod late into the night, surrounded by floating holographic screens showing research from Earth and other worlds. A soft tapping sound made him look up. Professor Reed, an alien biologist who specialized in Deathworld species, stood in the doorway. The professor's long, thin body was covered in soft fur that changed color with their moods, currently a gentle shade of green that Tom had learned meant curiosity. "Still awake, young human," Professor Reed's translator whispered. "I watched your performance today. Most fascinating. Most fascinating indeed." They glided into the room, their fur rippling. "But you don't know why it works, do you?" Tom shook his head. "My grandfather always said you had to feel the water. I thought it was just experience. But after today," he gestured at his research screens, "there has to be more to it." Indeed, Professor Reed's fur shifted to a bright yellow of excitement. "Tell me, what do humans and water have in common on your death world?" Tom thought about Earth, its crushing gravity, powerful magnetic field, and extreme weather. "They're both shaped by Earth's forces," he said slowly. "Water follows magnetic fields and underground pressure. And humans evolved to survive those same forces," Professor Reed finished. "Your species developed extraordinary sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, pressure changes, and gravitational variations. It was necessary for survival. Most species would be crushed by your world's gravity alone." The professor pulled up new screens showing human nervous system scans. "Look here, your body's developed special cells, sensors far more delicate than any we've built. You feel these forces unconsciously all the time. The dowsing rods simply give those feelings a physical form to follow." Tom stared at the scans, understanding dawning. "That's why the rods don't work as well for others. They're not tools that find water. They're tools that help us focus what we can already sense." "Precisely." Professor Reed's fur flashed patterns of academic excitement. "Your grandfather wasn't just experienced. He was naturally sensing electromagnetic variations caused by underground water movement. The rods only amplified what his nervous system already detected. They spent hours analyzing data from the day's tests. Tom's success rate wasn't random. It improved in areas with stronger electromagnetic fields. The rods worked better on worlds with higher mineral content because those minerals affected the local fields in ways his body could sense." "But why didn't we know this before?" Tom asked, looking at a scan of his own nervous system. "Because humans think of these abilities as primitive, unscientific. You stopped studying them when you developed mechanical sensors." Professor Reed's fur showed traces of blue, sadness. "Many species do this. They abandon natural abilities in favor of technology. But sometimes, biology creates better sensors than we can build." The next morning, Tom walked into the second day of challenges with new confidence. He understood now. The rods weren't magical or lucky. They were scientific instruments working with his body's natural capabilities. When Professor Firstlight announced the next test, Tom raised his hand. "Professor," he said clearly, "before we continue, I'd like to explain how dowsing actually works." He connected his data pad to the hall's display system, showing Professor Reed's research. "We humans have specialized cells that can detect electromagnetic variations. The dowsing rods help us interpret these sensations more precisely." The audience of scientists leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused on his explanation. Even Professor Firstlight's crystalline body showed patterns of interest as Tom explained the connection between Earth's harsh conditions and human evolutionary adaptations. "That's why the rods work better for some substances than others," Tom concluded. "They're not finding water directly. They're helping us focus our natural ability to sense how water and minerals affect electromagnetic fields." A buzz of excited discussion filled the hall. Tom saw several aliens making notes, their appendages moving quickly across their devices. Professor Firstlight floated closer. "Fascinating," they said. "You've taken a supposedly primitive technique and provided a scientific foundation for it. Perhaps." Their crystal body flickered thoughtfully. Perhaps there are other Deathworld abilities we should study more carefully. The final day of competition drew the largest crowd yet. The university's main observation dome was packed with beings from across the galaxy. News feeds broadcast everything live, and Tom knew his family back on Earth was watching. The pressure made his hands sweat as he checked his dowsing rods one last time. Professor Firstlight had chosen a small moon for the final challenge. Its underground cave systems were legendary for their complexity, and no complete map of them existed. Finding water here would test both technology and skill to their limits. The rules are simple, Professor Firstlight announced, their crystalline body glowing brightly. Find the largest underwater cave system within the next 6 hours. Safety markers must be placed at all access points. They turned to face the audience. Our university team will use our latest scanning technology. The human student will use his traditional methods. The university team moved out first, their hovering platforms carrying mountains of equipment. Tom watched them disappear over the horizon before starting his own search. The moon's light gravity made walking easier, but it also meant the electromagnetic fields were weaker. He would need to focus harder to feel them. For the first 2 hours, Tom found nothing but small water pockets. The rods shifted slightly in his hands, but never gave the strong cross that would indicate a major deposit. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe the fields here were too weak for his abilities to detect. Then he remembered something his grandfather had said. Water always tells a story. Don't just look for the water. Look for where it's been. Tom changed his approach, searching instead for traces of water flow through the rock. The rods began to respond differently, showing him a pattern he hadn't noticed before. There's a whole network, he muttered to himself, placing markers as he followed the trail. The water carved these caves over millions of years. The university team was having their own successes. Their three-dimensional maps showed several significant cave systems, and their accuracy was perfect. The audience watched both approaches with growing interest, especially when the two search patterns began to converge. 4 hours into the search, Tom's rod suddenly crossed so sharply they almost pulled out of his hands. At the same spot, the university team's equipment started showing unusual readings. Both groups had found something big. Incredible, one of the university scientists said, checking their scans. There's a massive cavern down there, but our equipment can't get clear readings of its extent. The mineral content in the rocks is interfering with the sensors. Tom closed his eyes, focusing entirely on what the rods were telling him. It's not just one cavern, he said quietly. The water flows through all of them. They're all connected. He began walking the perimeter, placing markers in a wide circle. The university team followed, their scanners confirming each location but unable to see the full picture. In the final hour, Tom made his most dramatic discovery. While the university team was mapping what they had found, his rods led him to a spot half a kilometer away. The pull was different here, stronger but also somehow deeper. There's something else down there, he called over the radio. Something big. The university team brought their equipment over. Their initial scans showed nothing but solid rock. But when they recalibrated their sensors based on Tom's electromagnetic sensitivity data, new readings appeared. By the stars, Professor Firstlight's voice crackled over the radio. There's an entire underground sea down there. The cave systems all feed into it. Their crystalline body flashed with patterns of excitement. Our scanners missed it completely because of the mineral interference, but the water's electromagnetic signature was clear enough for human senses to detect. As the judges compiled their final results, Tom stood at the edge of his marker circle, looking out over the moon's surface. Below his feet lay a hidden world of water and caves that might never have been found without the combination of advanced technology and his Deathworld-evolved senses. His grandfather would have loved this moment. Professor Reed appeared beside him, their fur showing swirls of proud gold and excited green. "You've done more than win a competition," they said softly. "You've shown us that progress doesn't always mean abandoning old ways. Sometimes it means understanding why they worked in the first place. The discovery of the underground sea changed everything. The university's main conference hall was filled to capacity as scientists from dozens of worlds gathered to discuss the implications. Tom sat in the front row, his dowsing rods lying on the table before him next to the most advanced scanner in the galaxy. Professor Firstlight hovered at the podium, their crystalline form projecting data onto the large screens behind them. "Our initial assumptions were wrong," they announced. "We believed human dowsing was primitive superstition. Instead, we have discovered something remarkable about Deathworld evolution." The screens showed side-by-side comparisons of scanner readings and Tom's dowsing results from the moon. The scanner data was precise but incomplete, showing blank spaces where mineral interference blocked the signals. Tom's results were less exact but showed the whole picture, including the underground sea that the scanners had missed. "The human nervous system," Professor Reed added, stepping up to join Firstlight, "evolved under conditions we considered too harsh for advanced life. Earth's powerful magnetic field, high gravity, and extreme weather created unique adaptations. Their fur rippled with excited patterns. The dowsing rods simply give physical form to sensations humans already receive, but usually ignore." An alien scientist raised a limb. "But why did our scanners fail to detect the underground sea? Our technology is far more advanced than two bent metal rods." Professor Firstlight's crystal body flickered. "Because we designed our machines to ignore certain signals we thought were interference. The same electromagnetic variations that confused our scanners were exactly what the human body evolved to detect." They turned to face Tom. "Sometimes the simplest tools are best because they don't filter out what we think is noise." The implications went far beyond finding water. Other scientists began sharing stories of primitive techniques from their own worlds that had never been properly studied. A scientist from a high-gravity world described how their ancestors could predict earthquakes by feeling vibrations. Another talked about finding valuable minerals using methods similar to dowsing. "We've been so focused on replacing these abilities with technology," Professor Reed said, their fur showing thoughtful blue patterns, "that we never studied why they worked in the first place." Each world's harsh conditions created different natural sensors in their native species. Tom looked at his grandfather's dowsing rods with new understanding. They weren't just tools. They were a bridge between natural abilities and scientific understanding. He thought about all the other primitive human abilities that might have similar scientific explanations. An excited buzz filled the hall as scientists proposed new research projects. Some wanted to study how the human nervous system detected electromagnetic fields. Others suggested developing new scanning technology that would work with natural abilities instead of replacing them. Even Professor Firstlight's initially skeptical team was drawing up plans to combine dowsing techniques with their advanced equipment. "But the most significant discovery," Professor Firstlight continued, their voice cutting through the excited discussions, "is not about water or caves or even dowsing. It's about how we judge other species and their methods." Their crystalline form glowed brightly. "We assumed that because humans came from a death world, everything about them must be primitive. We were wrong." The audience fell silent, considering this. Many of them had initially feared or looked down on Deathworlders like Tom. Now they were eagerly taking notes on human abilities and evolutionary advantages. "This is why we created the Galactic University," Professor Firstlight concluded. "Not just to teach, but to learn. Today, a student with 2 metal rods has taught us to question our assumptions about progress and technology." After the presentation, other students crowded around Tom's table, their fear of the Deathworlder completely forgotten. They wanted to try the dowsing rods, to understand how they worked, to share similar techniques from their own worlds. Even the university team that had competed against him was interested in learning his methods. Tom picked up the rods, remembering how his grandfather had first taught him. "The most important thing," he said, "is to stop thinking of them as primitive tools. They're scientific instruments that help us understand what our bodies can already sense." He held them out to a curious student. "Would you like to try?" 6 months later, Tom stood in a newly built classroom in the Ring of Knowledge, watching students from 20 different worlds practice with dowsing rods. The room was specially designed to generate various electromagnetic fields, allowing students to develop their sensitivity gradually. On one wall, advanced scanners displayed real-time readings that helped confirm what the students were sensing. "I feel something," announced a tall, insectoid student, the same one who had once been nervous about sharing a shuttle with Tom. Their antennae quivered as they held the rods. "The pull is different from last time." "Does that mean it's minerals instead of water?" Tom smiled, remembering when he had made the same discovery. "Trust what you're feeling," he said. "Each substance creates a unique pattern in the electromagnetic field. Your species' antennae are actually better at detecting subtle variations than human nerves." The university had created an entire new department, Integration of Traditional Sensing Techniques. Professor Firstlight and Professor Reed co-chaired the department, combining their expertise in geology and biology. Students could now learn both advanced technology and natural sensing methods from their own worlds. Tom's grandfather had finally visited the station, brought up on the first cultural exchange program between Earth and the galactic community. He spent a week teaching students and scientists about other traditional techniques humans had developed. His stories about finding water in the desert using nothing but dowsing rods and observation of nature had captivated everyone. "Your grandfather was right," Professor Firstlight said, floating into the classroom. Their crystal body now displayed teaching patterns they had learned from Earth's educational systems. "Sometimes the oldest tools work better than the newest machines, if you understand why they work." The professor's words were interrupted by excited shouts from the research lab next door. Tom and the professor hurried over to find Professor Reed's fur glowing bright gold with excitement. On their screens, data streamed in from a desert planet where a team was testing new hybrid scanning equipment. "Look at these readings," Professor Reed exclaimed. "The scanner is calibrated to work with the operator's natural electromagnetic sensitivity. They're mapping underground aquifers that satellite surveys missed completely. 3 desert settlements have already requested the technology." Tom watched the data flow in, feeling pride in how far things had come. The university now hosted students from several other Deathworlds, each bringing their own traditional techniques to study. A student from a high-gravity world had shown how their people found safe paths through unstable terrain by feeling gravitational variations. Another, from a world of constant storms, demonstrated how they could sense atmospheric pressure changes far more accurately than weather stations. "We're planning an expedition," Professor Firstlight announced, "to that underground sea you discovered. The university is building special submarines that combine sonar with biological sensing methods. We want you to lead the exploration team." Tom looked at the dowsing rods in his hands, his grandfather's old pair, now fitted with sensitive measuring devices that recorded and analyzed their movements. They were a perfect symbol of what the program had become, a bridge between old and new, natural and technological, Earth and the stars. "There's a saying on Earth," Tom said to his class as they gathered around the screens showing the desert planet survey. "Our ancestors knew more than we give them credit for. They just didn't always know why they knew it." The students nodded, some using translator devices, others understanding directly. On the walls, screens showed similar classes taking place on other worlds, beings of all types learning to trust their natural senses while understanding the science behind them. Later that evening, Tom stood at his favorite observation window, looking out at the stars. A group of first-year students walked past, carrying an assortment of traditional tools from their homeworlds alongside the latest scanning technology. They waved to him, not a single one showing the fear that had been so common just months ago. He touched the dowsing rods at his belt and smiled. His grandfather had been right about another thing too. Sometimes the best way forward was to look back and understand where you came from. Thanks to 2 simple metal rods and the courage to use them, the galaxy was finally learning that progress didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant building a bridge between yesterday's wisdom and tomorrow's discoveries.